All right, let's just jump right in. Today, we're doing a deep dive explainer on something pretty sprawling and honestly highly controversial. We're looking at Marcus Heinrich Rehbach's Welcome to the New World Order Quadrilogy. Now, right off the bat, I want to make something crystal clear. We are absolutely not here to endorse, validate, or debate the political claims in these texts. A lot of this is incredibly fringe and provocative stuff. What we're doing instead is taking an impartial, architectural look at the material. We're just going to map out the internal logic of the author's universe, breaking down how he builds his arguments, from his critique of history to the radical, utopian alternative he ends up proposing.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the core premise, move on to defining the cult, check out the mechanisms of control, look at how the author rewrites history, and finally, dive into the Eden Protocols.
Okay, Section 1, the core premise. So the absolutely crucial thing you have to grasp right from page 1 is the author's overarching worldview. This text argues straight up that a hidden elite has been executing a massive, multi-millennia strategy. We're talking a 3,000-year-old plot designed to end in absolute global dictatorship. According to this narrative, literally every modern crisis you can think of, economic crashes, global health events, none of them are random. They're all carefully orchestrated steps toward what the author calls a new world order. Basically, in this universe, there are zero coincidences. Everything is just a manufactured piece of a very, very long game.
Moving on to Section 2, defining the cult.
Now, to actually navigate this quadrilogy, including its prequel, you really have to learn the author's highly specific vocabulary. The main antagonist here is a group he calls the Cult of Judah. But what's really fascinating, and you have to pay attention to this distinction, is how painstakingly the author tries to separate this alleged elite from everyday Jewish people. The text frames its critique heavily around themes of Zionism, essentially painting it as a tool of this cult. But it explicitly claims that throughout history, everyday Jewish populations have actually been the primary victims and the strongest opposition to this elite group. The author sees this cult as a sort of parasitical force that just uses everyday populations as pawns.
Another huge piece of the puzzle is a term the author uses called the golem. Now, you know, in traditional folklore, a golem is an animated, unthinking creature made from mud, right? Well, the author takes that and turns it into a metaphor for the modern media, military, and political complex. According to the text, this massive complex is basically an unthinking machine. It just swallows the con of fiat paper money and executes the orders of these central elites without ever questioning a thing.
Which brings us to Section 3, mechanisms of control.
So you might be wondering, if this elite exists and the golem is their tool, how exactly is this global control pulled off? Well, the author outlines a very specific three-step economic conspiracy. Step 1. The elites use central banking systems to print endless amounts of fiat money right out of thin air. Step 2. They take all that limitless paper wealth and buy up global mass media, creating this unified propaganda machine. And Step 3. Through institutions like the IMF, they seduce individuals and even entire sovereign nations into taking on massive unpayable debts. This effectively plunges the global population into debt slavery and forces nations to just hand over their sovereignty. Honestly, this quote right here brilliantly captures the author's intense focus on economics. Let's just let the text speak for itself. The central bank printing presses are the true philosopher's stone. Just like that mythical stone was supposed to turn base metals into gold, the author argues that printing fiat money lets central bankers literally conjure power and ownership out of nowhere. It turns worthless paper into absolute control over humanity. It's a real game changer in his narrative. And you see this kind of systemic thinking a lot in the books. The author loves using structural and scientific analogies. Take a look at the schematic of an electronic circuit. It's a transistor amplifying a signal. He uses this exact concept to map out how the media, military, political complex amplifies the power of the elite. He actually describes society as an engineered inversion of reality, a system purpose-built to reflect the ambitions of these hidden architects. All right, Section 4, rewriting global history. Okay, now we're getting into one of the most controversial aspects of the entire explainer, the intense historical revisionism. The text presents this wildly alternative timeline. It actually goes all the way back to 1000 BCE, reinterpreting biblical events like the Babylonian exile as early political strategies of the cult. Then it jumps to 1913, framing the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve as this massive, critical coup. It goes on to engage in extreme WW2 revisionism, asserting that official histories were totally fabricated by the victors to hide their own crimes.
And moving into the modern era, it claims 9/11 was an engineered false flag and frames the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic as a manufactured exercise in global compliance and terror. Like I said, incredibly controversial claims. To justify all this, the author explicitly borrows that famous concept from George Orwell's 1984. Who controls the present, controls the past, controls the future. The argument here is that the elites who won the wars and control the present just systematically wrote the official history textbooks to retroactively justify everything they did. In this view, official history isn't fact. It's literally just the propaganda of the victors. Finally, Section 5, the Eden Protocol's solution. So you'd think this whole quadrilogy is just about detailing a dystopian nightmare, right? But actually, the author pivots completely to propose his own radical utopian countermodel. It's a stark contrast. On one hand, you have the New World Order that he fears, dystopian austerity, endless debt slavery, and constant manufactured warfare. But on the other hand, you have his proposed alternative, the Eden Protocols. He describes this as a universalist, strictly vegan, synergistic, and honestly almost post-human society. A place where the whole predator and prey cycle, both literally and economically, is totally broken. The bedrock of this utopian vision is this really fascinating philosophical concept he invented called the optimal ethics generator. The claim is that if society just adopts this incredibly specific ethical framework as its core motivation, it'll automatically replace all that opportunistic exploitation with true synergy. And we're talking indivisible justice for all sentient beings here, not just humans. So what does a society actually look like when it's running on the Eden Protocols? Well, according to the text, it means the total elimination of violence and a strictly enforced vegan society where animals are no longer exploited at all. It promises an absolute meritocracy and the total dismantling of what he calls beneficiary classes, so no more billionaires, no more hidden elites. And then, in this wild sci-fi twist, the text suggests these protocols could actually be implemented and monitored globally using programmable nanobots. Which brings us to the visual branding of the whole philosophy. This is the logo for True Not Norm, which is the publisher's imprint for the author's works. It's an acronym, and it stands for the reality of our natures and the nature of our realities. It just goes to show that the author doesn't see this as merely a political critique. It's meant to be a totally holistic lifestyle philosophy. It really highlights how all-encompassing these fringe manifestos try to be, basically building entirely self-contained realities for the reader to step into. And that pretty much wraps up our structural breakdown. After looking objectively at how this text is built, the sprawling historical revisions, the highly specific vocabulary, and those sci-fi utopian solutions, we are left with a pretty profound psychological question. When faced with a reality that is often chaotic, random, and frankly cruel, what does the appeal of such all-encompassing grand narratives tell us about our deep human desire to just make sense of a complex world? It seems like the urge to find a single, hidden architect behind all the chaos is an incredibly powerful draw, even if it leads down some remarkably dark and controversial rabbit holes. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narratives around you.